Okay, excellent. Today we have the last session of Conversaciones a la intemperie for this semester, which was delayed a little bit for several reasons. But we're very happy to have the last book of the series, which is Jasper Bernes' new book, The Future of Revolution, Communist Prospect from the Paris Commune to the George Floyd Uprising. It is a book that has, as some of us know, has been making rounds, and it has received already quite a lot of commentary. So we're very happy to continue that sort of ongoing discussion around the book that I believe that does many things at once. And in that sense, one could say that it's many books in one, because it's definitely not just a book about a conceptual history of the revolution, just like other books about the same problem that have been published this year, for instance. Rather, I would say that the book, in the wake of the revolt, or especially now, the new sequence of revolts that seems to emerge against the new sort of apparatus of the police, against ICE and mass deportation, sort of stages a critical inquiry into a, a basis for planning and for reflection that is not disconnected from overall strategy and political action overall. But I would say, perhaps doing a little bit of violence to the book, that Jasper's book is, like I said, maybe three books at once. It is, first of all, a reconstruction of the council form in the history of the work of movement, which has been understudied in these years. Although a sort of, as they say in Spanish, un secreto a voces, no? A secret in the open, that is well known. But Jasper's the book is, I think, one of perhaps the first book that thematizes it and explores its actuality and productivity in our contemporary debates. The book also thematizes conditions for the test of communism, avec the destruction of value, in what is, I think, a very rich discussion with ongoing theories of communization, from Amadeo Bordiga, contribution to the board, to the American context of the 1940s, such as Grace Lee and Cyril James, to the more contemporary discussion of endnotes and communization. And finally, the book closes, and this will be the third sort of book within the book. It closes with a reflection about the current predicament in the new cycle of revolts that we have witnessed, not only in the US, but more broadly. In this series, we have had the chance to talk with a French sociologist, Michali Lianos, that has referred to these revolts as experiential revolts. Right? And it will be interesting to see whether the contemporary revolts in this new metamorphosis, right, are part of a continuation, or precisely sort of disjointed new form, or perhaps an informed sort of interruption of the old revolutionary horizon. The book, I think, closes with that sort of question that is not resolved, and it will be perhaps a discussion for today, whether revolts and revolution in the age of stagnation and general demobilization can learn anything from the councils, and perhaps also go beyond it. Okay. But I'll leave it at this point. I think that the future of the revolution is also interesting in the sense that it's trying to think the question of permanence, duration of ethical consistency, and this is not part of Jasper Bernes' vocabulary, and he might disagree with it, but I would say also a thorny question in some other clusters of debate, which have to do with the question of institution, right? In the strong philosophical sense, not necessarily in the sociological or normative dimension, right? But one could read maybe the console form in this in this line, which has precisely been uh, an empty space for revolutionary theory at large, you know. That is what to do the day after, right? How to organize the what Daniel James, the great historian of Peronism, called the day after mobilization, you know? The temporality of demobilization. And for today's session, we have good friends, some of them that have participated before. First, we have Catherine Nelson, who is a um, philosopher who is doing her research at DePaul University, and also Philippe Tefanidis, who has been here multiple times from York University. And we'll miss Rodrigo Carmi, who was supposed to join us for this session, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. But I'm sure that he will provide his commentary on the book in written form very soon. Of course, we have Jasper Bernes with us. And so having said that, we'll now open it for the intervention and then later on for our discussion.
Could we hear from Jasper first about the origin or the genesis of the book? I'm happy to jump in, but I'm curious for that context.
Sure. Well, I think I started writing about this material over 10 years ago. It was sort of in the period after Occupy Oakland, and there was something in the Bay Area called the public school. And, at that time, there was an interesting milieu of anarchists and communists who were really interested in these theoretical questions. There was at least, 100 or something people in the Bay Area who you could get and come to a big session on communism and value. And, I'd been reading, so-called communization theory, people like Gilles Dauvé and others on how communism might emerge. And I, found myself very influenced by it. But there's this particular construction of Marx's idea of value that I just found sort of vexing and problematic. And I really wanted to get to the bottom of it. And I wanted to get to the bottom of these questions like, was the USSR really state capitalist? Was value operating in the USSR, as, for example, Bordiga noted? And I saw that in that were real questions about what communism was, which, is in some ways, there's this sense in which we all know what it is. It's, classless, moneyless, stateless society. But there's also this way in which we don't know what it is, in the sense that it's yet to emerge. Sorry, it's very loud. Sirens here. It's one of the problems of broadcasting from downtown Oakland. So, and I started working on that and reading in these debates about value and communism and actually existing socialism. And then half of that article ended up turning into this article on planning that I published with South Atlantic Quarterly, I think. I don't know. At some point, it's called Planning and Anarchy. But it left this kind of this stump behind, which was about value and communism, and the ways in which I had deduced that Dauvé wasn't quite right in his idea about what value was and how it could be used to diagnose whether something was communist or not, and the kind of fate and trajectory of certain experiments, even though I was really sympathetic to Dauvé's perspective, and I still am. I mean, in many ways, I think of this book as a kind of rewriting or perhaps a modernization of Dauvé's Eclipse and Reemergence of the Communist Movement, which is still, really one of my favorite books. But it was written in, 1970, and things that looked very clear then look different now. So, and then, I had this book contract with Verso. I told them I was going to write this one book, and then I realized I couldn't write that book. And then in the pandemic, You know, it also just seemed like the pandemic was such a massive shift. So much changed around the George Floyd uprising and the pandemic, that I really felt like, you know, I needed to rethink certain things. And so I got into writing about this again, partly because a lot of people were interested in this value form theory. And I'm interested in it too. I'm interested in some of the ideas, but I also see its limitations. And I thought that I had an answer to the question of, like, why do we care about value? And why do we care about Marx's concept of value? And so and that comes, and that debate through Devey actually opens up into this questions about council communism, because Devey's treatment of value is a critique of historical council communism. And so in some way that chapter that I wrote about value then opened into this other thing, which is really thinking about the history of council communism and of the Workers' Council, i.e. the first chapter. But I wanted to write about these things not as history, but as about, living examples, as it were, that still persist in practice today. And so that was the question, was how I could kind of relate it to contemporary struggles, which, kind of emerged in this moment in 1968, where there's both this revival of council communism, and there is a kind of revival of the council form, but it encounters very different conditions in the post-war world. And there's this debate about council communism and about the trajectory of communism that emerges from communization theory, which I'm very interested in and still draw a lot from. So I thought I could kind of give an assessment of struggle since 68. And what I think of as kind of the broader ultra-left include both council communism and its critique by communization. And, in the end, what I want to say is, even though these are kind of, perspectives that often are very antagonistic to each other, and these people still kind of hate each other. And you can see from some of the reviews to my book that they just really dislike being lumped together in the way that my book does. But, for me, I want to emphasize what they share, right? Which is, a number of things, a kind of commitment to self-organization as the fundamental motor of revolution, and a kind of anti-pedagogical and anti-pastoral way of relating to struggles that comes from council communism, that insists that theory is imminent to struggle, and it develops from struggles, and struggles are kind of themselves acts of figuring things out, and they don't need militants to come to them and tell them what to do, or to kind of give them lessons. And so I think that that's true both of the approach you get in the broader world of communization, such as it is, including many people who probably don't even would refuse that term, and council communism. So 50 years later, the differences don't seem quite as stark to me. That's the idea. So.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Am I totally off script here, Gerardo?
No. Go ahead.
I think
ask the question, and then if you want to follow up after that and do your intervention, that's fine. Yeah,
I'm just curious. I'm actually not familiar with the, you mentioned this problem in the reviews of the book, and I'm sorry to say that I haven't familiarized with this is bad on me. I haven't familiarized myself with that. So I'm just curious. I'm curious what you have in mind.
Well, so I often write for the book on Rail, which, is edited by my friend Paul Maddock. And his father, the other Paul Maddock, is a big figure in my book. And so he's been a big supporter of this book. And in a way, I was really stuck. And it was only through he, fortuitously moved out here to San Francisco. For the last few years, he's lived out here since the pandemic, and we knew each other, but we became friends. And it was really through that friendship, and he participated in a reading group that I did. I sort of was stuck with the book, and I decided to do a reading group on the Workers' Council, and he participated in it, and he ran he was part of the American, Council Communist organization in the 60s with his dad, Root and Branch. And so he just, so he was always like, you should read this or you should read that. And he was, he doesn't necessarily agree with my perspective, but he was very supportive, and it really helped me finish the book. It was through friendship with him that I was able to see things clearly. So he put together a kind of dossier on the book, and he got in touch with some of his contacts. It's one person whose name is Charles Reeve, and he's a Portuguese writer who's lived in France since the Portuguese Revolution. I actually quote from him in the book, and when I'm treating the Portuguese Revolution, but he really didn't like what I had to say. He was very critical, in a classically kind of counter-communist way. And he still thinks that these communization people are clowns, which, by the way, is what also Paul Maddock thinks too. I mean, he continued to be like, well, I still think these people are idiots. He met them at the center of this, at the origin of communization theories, this piece that Gilles Devey wrote in French, which was a intervention for this big gathering that ECO had called, and they brought together, what was then World Council Communism, all kinds of different people. This French group that comes out of Socialisme au Barbarie, and they had invited Paul Maddock, and both of the Maddocks came to this thing and met Devey, and so Devey had written this thing, this response to Paul Maddock, and takes him as somehow kind of exemplary. And so, I've been able to hear the story of this meeting where, and Paul Maddock thought Gilles Devey was an idiot, and Gilles Devey thought Paul Maddock was an idiot. No doubt they still think they're idiots. I don't hope to actually mend any of these things. I'm hoping to kind of speak to a generation that might have a different perspective on it. I respect them all. So anyway, so we got Jorge Velasquez, and there was this other guy. So one of the things that Devey criticizes is this book called The Fundamentals of Communist Production and Distribution. That's sort of at the center of the book in some ways, because the character Jan Appel, he's a major character in the first two chapters, and the second chapter is about the fate of this document that he produced. And in the first chapter, I kind of tell his life story through the story of the German Revolution. And so I'm gonna lost my train of thought here. So what was the answer? What question was I answering for you again? Just
I asked you about the conflicting reviews of your book.
Right. Okay. Oh, right. So the group that published the Grand Principium, the GIK, so Paul also got apparently the last surviving member of the GIK to write a response. He also didn't like it. So this is what I'm saying, that these council communists are, I don't even know if Charles Reeve would describe himself as a council communist, but they didn't like the book. And maybe, Charles Reeve's more of an anarchist or identifies anarchism. Anarchists also some of the anarchists really dislike the treatment of anarchism in the book for some reason, particularly syndicalism. I'm kind of critical of syndicalism. And so, yeah.
Okay. I think I should say my piece now, right? But I'm so fascinated by all these differing receptions, and I'll probably just have an insignificant
one. That was one place. I mean, I haven't seen that repeated elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I guess now I feel the need to say, okay, I'm not a communist. I'm not a anarchist. I'm not a syndicalist. I can't identify with any of these labels. But I did find this text really interesting. And so I guess my first comment is I just want to say a few things about what I liked about the book. And then I want to ask I know I could go on for a while, but what I really want to ask about is just the concept of revolution. So, but yeah, I guess I should also clarify, in addition to not being any of those political identities, or not being able to identify with any of those political identities outright, I feel very glad for the invitation to have read this book. I feel very out of my wheelhouse. So I'm not a historian. I'm not particularly familiar with with Marxism, or these various tendencies of Marx, post Marxism. But and I really haven't been focused on political material as of late. And yet, but all that said, I am glad to have read the text. And I actually, with all due respect, I surprised myself by enjoying reading it. I thought the history, yeah, and I'll say why. But I want to begin with a quote from it's the end of the book, page 169, that I really appreciated. So you write, to burn 2, 3, 4, many police stations seems suicidal, absent the possibility of cultivating a form of life that could do without the police. Nor can one build the new world in the burnt out husks of the former. One needs its wealth, its real resources and capabilities. I appreciated those lines because I've read things from a sort of militant communist tendency or anarchic tendency that would just affirm a revolutionary perspective or what it wants to be a revolutionary perspective outright. And what I felt from this book, it's called The Future of Revolution. It's coming from an explicitly communist perspective, but there's a certain sobriety, I think, in both its account of past and present historical upheaval. So just to be really, I hope it's okay that I'm a bit informal here, but in the first chapter, the Workers' Council and the Communist Project, the events of 1917 to 1923 in Germany, you don't pretend that there was just a single party or a single organization that directed things. You really attend to the complex, overlapping, and you say at one point even redundant councils, parties, organizations, and even militias. And history is that, it's that complicated. And so to have the story told in that respect, I think is really, again, sober, right? Honest. You don't shy away from right, the deadly aspect of this history in chapter 1. And then you also comment on really explicitly just really obvious limitations to workers' self-organization, such as the fact, and this is in your account of the history in Spain. You say individual collectives sought advantage for their members irrespective of consequences beyond their workplace, right? And these are supposed to be the revolutionary councils. And so I just appreciated, right, you're telling this history, you're endorsing this history, you're trying to, right, take this idea of the council from it as, right, a hopeful form, but you don't pretend that there aren't complications, right? You don't smooth over these historical controversies. And I just thought that was really, it made the history honestly much easier to read. It felt more even resonant, I think, with the present. And I don't mean that. I don't mean even. I mean, it felt resonant with the present. Right? It felt believable. So I appreciated that. You extended that sobriety, at least, again, like from the communist, from the anti-statist perspective. Also, I think to the account of the George Floyd uprising, which is just more familiar to me, in those closing pages. And I'm thinking here of, right, you get this account, and Gerardo mentioned it, of the George Floyd uprising at the end of the text. And I mean, you again here, you don't pretend that, right, what was an insurrectionary moment, a revolutionary moment, didn't descend, or even devolve, I think we might say, into and you use pretty explicit language, criminal rackets, right, militants looking for ways to extend confrontation, chaotic gun battles. And in so doing, right, and I don't mean to just only emphasize the negative of these moments, but in so doing, you don't present this sort of rosy romantic picture of that time, but you also refuse, right, the liberal version of that narrative and the right-wing version of that narrative as well. So again, this is all to say, overarchingly, I appreciated the sobriety, I thought, in which you approached issues of political upheaval, both past and present. That's what I appreciate. And to jump maybe like way too quickly to what I'm thinking about, and it's maybe mostly focused on your title, or I can focus it around your title. While I'm reading this text, I'm really thinking, what is revolution today? Throughout the text, I felt that right, we get this emphasis on the inadequacy of a restricted notion of the political. And if I read correctly, my impression was that sort of at least one of the promise of the councils, and you name it as a sort of limit as well as a requirement for the movement that you would like to see, is the overcoming of a strict separation, practical separation of politics and economics. That's you sort of repeated that over and over again throughout this is the promise of the councils as far as you see it. And I think that's really intriguing. I wonder, and this is not critical, this is like, I don't mean this as a negation of something that you're putting forward in the book, but I just wonder, you know, is the concept of revolution that a lot of leftists work with, and actually maybe maybe also people who would like to support Trump think with today, overly political in the sense of restricted. And so again, maybe this is coming from left field. I'm not exactly involved in the currents I think that you're coming from, but I just think, you know, when I think of this term revolution, I think, and I'll just lay this out in a little bit, my last thing. I think not just about, okay, the legitimacy of the sitting president is in question, the legitimacy of extant constitutions are in question. You know, some people are forecasting a constitutional crisis, so on and so forth. But what of, and I think this is thinking with you, or I hope that it is, what of the revolution that some people say is taking place with artificial intelligence? Where, you know, computation, cognition, right, labor and creativity itself is just being totally upset by developments, right, like ChatGPT, large language models. What of the revolution, right, that some people will say is a sort of third industrial revolution that they declared at one point in the information revolution? I know that this is a language that was more popular, right, maybe 10 years ago, when we were all still, or 10 or 20 years ago, and we were still trying to catch up. Right, but there's a revolution ongoing, right, in information itself. Communication, computation, and certainly surveillance, yeah? All of these things are being massively affected. There's a revolution ongoing, right? And I hope this isn't too crude or too silly to say, but when you think the future revolution, I'm prompted to think, what about the revolution ongoing in biotech? Where, right, you have these, suddenly we can alter I mean, not suddenly for everyone, but certainly for me, right, that we can alter the biological codes of life itself through these supposed innovations in gene editing, synthetic biology, thinking of CRISPR and so forth. I will go on just a few more, because I do want to flesh this out, and I don't mean to just make the word revolution totally empty, right? You could say that that's what I was doing. That's not my point. My point is that we are living in, it seems like we're living in a revolutionary time, and a concept of revolution, I think, even thinking with this book, right, ought to be able to think about these ongoing alterations as well. I also think, right, there's this, some people would say that there's an ongoing revolution in energy, where there's a shift, you know, by way of the urgency of the climate situation, right, toward the electrification of everything. There's knowledge and the science of human behavior is changing with what some will call a neuroscientific revolution, or the revolution in neurotech. And then there is this, I don't know, I'm sure we all have very different opinions about this or feelings about it, but it seems like there's at least a deep upset to what we know as finance, by way of, right, the emergence of cryptocurrencies. So I have a lot more thoughts on all of these things, but in all of these dimensions, and I don't mean to just overcomplicate stuff, but the future of revolution seems to me to beg all these, not to beg all these questions, but to ask about all these other dimensions. And just to return to the text briefly, I felt this line, or this line was good. So you echo, this is in the middle of the book, or no, it's at the end of the first chapter. You echo Lauren Goldner echoing Jan Appel. Yeah, and you say, okay, we could attribute the lack of revolutionary vision to a contemporary anti-utopianism, which refuses the positing of solutions not imminent to struggles themselves. So again, I'm thinking, how much can we transcend, yeah, this distinction between the political and the economic? You know, how big can our imaginations be? I hope that wasn't too much to put on the table. I know it's a bit loose, but I just thought about that, the future revolution. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
How do you want to play it, Jasper or Gerardo? Jasper, do you prefer to respond now, or do you want to wait?
You could, let's do both the presentations.
Everything, and then, yeah, super, works for me. Okay, so like Kate, I'm also Kate, I'm happy you went first in the end. So I'm not coming with, I haven't read the 3 volumes of Capital, that's for sure. One of them is behind me, but I still need to get to it. So in a way, I'm coming a little bit from the outside, and that gives a specific value to the book. So I'm here to say, even if people are not entirely familiar with all the framework of what is being discussed, the book offer quite a good introduction, especially since you start from the Commune in 1871, right? And you run all the way through the 20th century to the most recent events. So it's a short book, but it offers really a great overview and a great introduction to try to quickly take stock of not only where we come from, where we stand, but of course from the title also where maybe we could go. Okay. And there was a lot of stuff, KPD, KAPD. I learned, I took some time to try to learn everything. I turned to that book where you also published something, I think, Jasper, that's Benjamin Noyes, very useful also as a very short introduction. So I'm saying I come from the outside, but when Gerardo mentioned the book, I told him, I need to read it because I have concrete problem to solve at work. I've been working for a union in my own university, and very recently we had this discussion with a colleague because of course nothing works, right? They are crushing all the universities in the States. In Canada it's the same thing, and same thing in the UK. And the professors are often more interested in working on their own book than trying to fix the situation within their own work environment. So the question was a very concrete question. If the union itself cannot mobilize folks, if collegial governance, Senate, etc., faculty council cannot do anything, then what form of mobilization or organization do we have, right? And it was immediately this question of forms that was put on the table. What other forms of organization can we come up with so we can change the status quo? And instinctively, the reflex was to turn to the past. I said immediately worker consult, and somebody else said the commune, right? We have two forms there that we could try import within the walls of academia. I'm not sure it would ever work. It worked in the 60s. Right now, I'm not as optimistic, but that's the concrete point of entry I took into the book. I was looking not for a theoretical overview, although it's super interesting. I was really looking, can we name a new form? And of course, that question is fundamental. How can we name a new alternative form of coexistence that does not fall into all the problems we already know? Because existing forms are not working properly. Like, we cannot do much with democracy. We're seeing what's happening in the US, for instance. So we need something else. And now I entered the book hoping that at least even if that new form, and I believe you don't name any new form, even if that new form is not named, at the very least it provides a context on which we can stand to try to reach that new form. So that was my point of entry. I need to flag, because for me it's too obvious not to be named, I need to flag that we are four scholars together discussing a book, right, about revolution, which often is conducted by folks in the street who are far away from academia as well. And there is a gap there that we could discuss and try to bridge, right? How does the book that you wrote, how does it play in the street, for instance? This, I think, speaks to something that is really recurrent in your book, that you do not develop, but you take for granted, and you put really clearly at the very beginning, you refuse the distinction between practice and theory. That's a constant throughout the book. So I'm thinking at some point maybe we could go back there. And I have 2-3 other points that I want to raise. The problem of naming the new form of coexistence immediately also reminds us that revolution, as many have observed before us, at least since the French Revolution, revolution often is also a revolution in language. Trying to do the revolution, and the book really put emphasis on, for instance, first step, you need to disarm, remove the arm of the army, remove the arm of the police. That's one thing. But it was often observed that a revolution, a true revolution that takes place, is also a revolution, a very strong revolution in language, where old categories are abandoned and new categories are adopted, right? And I was wondering, that might be one of the questions I want to put to you, and for a very specific reason, which is not tied specifically to this book. how do you approach the writing itself, the production of the book? And I'm thinking, and I'm getting at the gist of this specific question, because we know you also wrote poetry, right? So you are playing with different modes of expression, trying to invoke something that does not exist right now, and you're trying to invoke it through a play with language. So that's something I would like us to go back to, especially the relationship between revolution and language, and much more explicitly, I'm thinking, I was reading your new piece on Joshua Clover this morning, and I'm also thinking about Sean Bonney, for instance, the relationship between revolution and poetry, for instance. Another important aspect that we could discuss, and also I believe that runs through the entire book, the relationship between form and content. Not explicitly theorized, because there would be a lot to say about the relationship between form and content, but clearly a very, very important dynamic with you. And we're talking, for instance, about the difference between political form, as Kate mentioned, political form and economical form, and then the content of these forms. For instance, the commune was at once a form and a content. And I was thinking how you are thinking the relationship between form and content, because traditionally they are thought as being different, if not as being opposite to one another. But that's not the only way to conceive the relationship between form and content. And there has been position taken, at least since antiquity, and it runs also through the 20th century, where form and content cannot be distinguished. There is a refusal of the distinction between content and container, for instance. So that I would also be interested in discussing, because it relates to my first point. We are in a situation where we are trying to assess, to identify, to see, to observe, to find a new form, right? The future of revolution. That's not only the new form, the new way a new form could emerge, but it's also this form itself once emerged, and it relates to Gerardo's comment. Once it has emerged, and I will come to the idea of emergence, how can it sustain itself without becoming static? Because becoming static, that's the institution and the becoming state of a form that have been completely instituted. And that's not something we want to go through when we are trying to change the status quo, right? The reason we call it the status quo. So this relationship between form and content, very much interested in it, and I would like to hear more about it. There is an apex, to use a fancy term. There is, in the very beginning of the book, a single instance, never repeated in the entire book, which caught my attention, and for me is a promise. And that's not negative criticism, that's a promise within your book. It's, for me, the most rich, underdeveloped point that I would like myself to take and run with it and try to expand it. And that's, I believe it's Simone Weil, but I could be mistaken with Luxembourg. It's the woman, and you were reading her and you thought, and you express it in your book, this is very close from complexity theory and the theory of emergence, right? So in your book, I just ran a quick search. I think there is 67 mention of emergence, but the theory of emergence itself is super interesting. And this, I would like to hear more from you about it. And saying that, I realize also that it would require importing sources that are not sources close to Marxism or the history of revolution. It would mean turning to philosophy or stuff like that. So I'm going to put one problem to you, and we can discuss that, and then I'm going to move to my last point. The state as it is right now, or we could call it the status quo, is a problem, and that problem needs to be changed. We are now, incredible coincidence, or maybe it's not a coincidence at all. Maybe there was no way for you to publish a book without at some point hitting at the same time a new insurrection, which just happened, right? What we are witnessing, all of us, and watching happening in LA, but now in other cities too, is something that I would suggest and put to you as an hypothesis, something that is between a complete absence of form and a static form. We are watching precisely and that's why I thought it was super interesting, the emergence of something that cannot exactly be named, and we don't know if it will sustain itself in time. We don't want it to fall into an institution. To a certain extent, it could be said, and it was written, for instance, that the BLM movement was instituted and become ossified or completely static in a point. So we don't want to go there. But how can we maintain an emerging form without turning it into something static? And in the theory of emergence, there is a very concrete example that is given to us that exists and can be observed every day. It's the flock, for instance, murmuration, flock of birds, school of fish, right? Which do not have a and I love the dog. And these forms, the murmuration, does not have a static form because it's not something finished that you could draw and that's it. I saw a murmuration. If you try to draw a murmuration, you won't be able to render what you actually experience. But it's also not something that you can ignore because you recognize something. So the murmuration is a concrete example of something that would be in between the complete absence of form, where nothing at all is recognizable, and a very static form. And I'm wondering how you could use that, develop on your comment about complexity theory, to try to see where what is happening currently in the streets in the United States is actually going. And if it could achieve something that is not collapsing into complete formlessness, nor being co-opted into a static form. Okay, I'm putting that as maybe a third way into what you call the future of revolution. Last point is much shorter. It has to do with since at the very beginning we mentioned the fact that a revolution often, when it's strong, is a revolution in language because new terms are introduced. I was wondering about your own relationship with the category, and I think Kate mentioned that a little bit. Your own relationship with the category of politics. No need right now to go into the difference between the political and politics, etc. But the category of politics in general, it's central to the book because, of course, there is a constant reflection for you and commentary about the relationship between the economical form and the political form. But I'm thinking, do we want to keep the category of politics? Of course, the 20th century also is riddled with attempt to leave the category of politics behind, right? Post-foundational politics, the unpolitical, etc., etc. How do you stand, or what is your view about for the future about the value of the category of politics? And this question is informed by readings I've done with Gerardo over the past couple of years. Especially, and everyone recognized my accent, French accent. Reading about Dionys Mascolo, in Dionys Mascolo, not well-known figure even among French folks, but he was a very important thinker, and today we would call him an activist, but I wouldn't use that label with him. At some point, he had this quip. He said, if somebody asked me about my identity, and maybe Kate, you will relate to that. If somebody asks me about my identity, I will say I am a communist. And this is not a political statement. And that was a very striking statement by Dionys Mascolo. Elsewhere, just closing comment, he wrote a very, very tiny essay about the meaning of the word left, sur l'usage et le sens du mot gauche, right? On the use and the meaning of the word left. And in there, he also very on purpose provoke the reader by saying there is no freaking difference between the left and the right. The only meaningful difference there is between being revolutionary or not being revolutionary. So with that on the table, the three main points I mentioned, and maybe with emphasis on this idea of form and formlessness, I open the floor to you. And maybe Gerardo wants to say a few words before. Thank you.
Well, I just want to just maybe say one thing, but I think that it connects to both what you, Philippe, and Catherine mentioned. And I think is connected in the relation, which both of you have mentioned in separate ways, between revolution and form, right? Which is a, one could say, as a phenomenological reduction, it's a center it's a center problem of political modernity at large, right? And on page 158, that is, I guess everyone has their moment, right, of emergence, or being able to see something visible in the richness of the book. But in page 158, Jasper says something that I found very illuminating. And he writes that, and I quote, he says, "One way to clarify what has changed is to say that if the revolution of the 20th century was a circle centered on the workplace, it was now an ellipse." I wonder if we can say that it is an ellipse still today. It seems to me that it is, right? I mean, according to this reconstruction that Jasper is offering here, with one focus, eccentric to the workplace, and another within it, right? And it continues sort of deploying this configuration, right? And based on this formalization of between circle and ellipse, I wonder if precisely one way in which one can push forward, right, something other than the category of revolution based on circularity, a circularity that I would say that is also predicated, at least one way that it has always been helpful for me to think about revolution is in the polarity between rupture and continuation, that polarity, which is also expressed, you could say, in political terms between constituted and constituent power, right? The moment that the French Revolution is victorious is the moment that Saint Just, for instance, is claiming a sort of relaunching of the future of revolution based on the authority of the fathers that did the revolution, right? So conservation and interruption are two poles of this circularity, right? But it's also the circularity, I would say, talking about the 1970s, it's a circularity that pertains to a sort of closure of capitalism as it becomes a process of real subsumption, right? Lacan in 1973, the same moment that also Kamat is writing about revolution, right? And the thesis of the anthropomorphization of capital, Lacan says that along with his three main discourses, there is a fourth discourse, which is the discourse of capital. And that fourth discourse of capital introduces, Jasper mentioned the figure, which is very important for politics in the West, right? The figure of the shepherd, right? The pastoral politics, right? One could say the arché, right? The commanding principle. Well, but the commanding principle now becomes the subject, right? It becomes the subject of the political and the political subject. And circulation, the circulatory sort of notion of revolution, I think it becomes defunct precisely in the moment that capital becomes or transforms itself into real subsumption. So all of this to say that I wonder if the revolt or the sort of explosion of the human species, one could say, right, is a radical detachment, and it needs to be read as a radical detachment from the way that this sort of modern form of revolution took place. I feel that the book has a tension with that tradition because, of course, if one says yes to that question, that would mean, I would think, a radical destruction, right, in the metaphysical sense, a radical destruction against the revolutionary tradition, right? All things considered, one could say, right? But I wonder if any of this resonates or maybe not. I guess as a side note, I guess another question would be, along with this, is whether the critique of metaphysics, right, can be thought in relation to political economy, right? Or whether taking into account metaphysical critique necessarily pushes, right? Pushes political economy, not as an inconvenient thing or a hurdle, but rather as something that that doesn't get us into a, let's call it an epochal breakthrough.
Yeah.
So whoever, I don't know, Jasper, if you want to say something,
Okay.
whoever wants to.
So that's a lot. Thank you, all three of you, for your comments. The remarks at the end are really interesting, and I think that they could be a discussion in and of themselves. I suspect we really disagree, but I would have to clarify. And I think that the sort of position that you're advocating is something that my book is in some way written against. At the same time, I'm really open to there being, I think that there is another way, another way communism might emerge in a non-revolutionary sense that's a little bit closer to the Kamadian vision. I tend to think that there's not really much one can say about that emergence. So I don't rule it out, but I still think that everything, everything in the world still points to the kind of liveliness of, in some sense, the revolutionary tradition inherited from 1848. And we're still within, in as much as we're still in capitalism, it's still fundamentally structured by those laws. At that very abstract level, revolution, in as much as it's defined as the negation of that, of class society and of capitalism, I think it's still, thinkable essentially through those terms. But maybe we can loop back to that. Okay, so I mean, one thing that keeps coming up is this notion of the political, and I think that that's really important. Like in some sense, I think you're absolutely right, Catherine. That the way to describe what is problematic about contemporary struggles is that they are overly political in some sense, and that the revolution has no horizon beyond political revolution. There can be a kind of military exploration of that, where it's like the vision is simply guerrilla warfare or civil war. It's a contestation for power, and there's no thought of social reproduction or the economy, which to me is a dead end. And so, and I would say that, even that's true of the current uprising, right? It's oriented towards the state, and it is a contestation with the state, and that's a limit. And that's a limit in as much as it would try to pass to something revolutionary, which is not to say it can't do that. But there is an implicit demand to this movement, unlike the 2020 George uprising, which is stop the deportations and stop the detentions. Certainly people in the streets have more radical demands, but that's pretty much essentially the terrain of contestation. And and that's directed to the political, and not the entirety of the political, but Trump, right? And that's one of the dangers of the kind of capture of it by a kind of anti-Trump constituency. And we see that with like the No Kings protest, which is trying to make the anti-uprising into an uprising just against ICE, who are the bad police, but really in support of all the good police, including the National Guard, who like come out to point guns at people. And so to me, that's the danger of a vision which sees everything in political terms, right? And it's just about this. There's no horizon beyond, getting somebody elected, or perhaps, I think with the 2020 uprising, my analysis, like a real danger, and this is something you guys probably know about, of the horizon of that, is this emergence of a kind of constitutionalism or a kind of referendumism, which we see in the Gilets jaunes and the estallido social, and this kind of tendency towards constitution as a solution. And to me, that's something radically different than I'm thinking about in terms of commune and council, because it hasn't because it's not about overcoming the distinction between the political and the economic. These are political bodies. They're not working bodies in the sense that they're reproducing people's lives. And that's what a council is, right? It's not a political institution. It's about the reproduction of society directly. In as much as it, is about that, it kind of tends to break down the distinction between the economy and politics, right? It's just life. Those are the decisions. And it would be breaking down also, the way that the workplace and the neighborhood are connected. Consumption and production is also bound up with that. And so that's, why I emphasize that you need to, plan in such a way that you're not connecting the two through a kind of something like the wage, this kind of labor certificate. So yeah, I mean, I think that's I definitely think, and I would say, I would even say that it's like, to me, the problem with the kind of critique of metaphysics perspective is that it is too political. It doesn't have anything to say about the economy, and is fundamentally like doesn't really think these concrete, practical questions about matters of life and death, which are technical, they're material, they're biological, and they're real, and they are the basis of, they are the fundamental substrate of revolution, right? And so to me, that's where sometimes, whereas I think ultimately we're talking about the same thing, but to me, there's a kind of, I would say some things that emerge from like the broader kind of appelist world, I think, do end up erring on the side of a kind of overly political conception. But Decunism, such that it even exists, or appelisme, does have its own way of thinking about this overcoming of the opposition, which is again and again, they talk about this distinction between living and fighting, right? And the goal is to bring them together. This is something they get from autonomy in the 1970s. And I think that that's fundamentally the same thing that I'm talking about, right? Overcoming the distinction between economic and the political is overcoming the distinction between living and fighting. It's also what, when Joshua talks about the commune in Riot, Strike, Riot, he's also, he really talks about it in these terms, right? As this kind of, it overcomes the oppositions, the structure of the riot against the strike, consumption against production, and produces something that is neither economic nor political, neither living nor fighting, but fuses them and doesn't allow for their kind of separation. I've always really liked that particular essay. The question about revolution in general, it's an interesting one, but I think that they mean two different things. It's just like when we talk about a technological revolution or a cultural revolution, it's just a different thing than a revolution. We're talking about a revolution that changes social organization directly. It's not the same thing as a transformation of like technologies. They're very different. They have very different effects. And fundamentally, all of these revolutions are happening within capitalism, and they're structured by the laws of capitalism. And, I tend to think that most of this stuff is overstated in terms of its effects and its newness. I don't think it's really fundamentally, in many respects, it's not really that different than a lot of other kind of technical transformations of labor and everyday life that have taken place, in the last 50 years. Of course, when we talk about the reason why my book is written in such a general way, and this will get to the question about form and function eventually. The reason why my book is written in such a general way is that I can't tell you how to make a revolution or what it will look like, right? Because there's a million different ways that might unfold. What I can tell you is the kind of the logical landscape, the conditions that it would need to fulfill, the functions it will need to achieve. And I can only talk about it in that way because I don't know exactly how it will emerge. And that's something for revolutionaries to figure out in their own conditions. And that's where these questions around AI and biotech and policing really come in. I do think I think the revolution is that's the most serious for us as revolutionaries is the revolution in military affairs and the incredible power of surveillance and organized violence the state now has. And I think that, drones and these are significant things to think about, but that's a very, sort of technical question that like is at another kind of level. And I think that, these are all things that need to be considered in any particular context. So for example, it's like the landscape of revolution is a landscape where you have Waymos and Lime maps, and so they get used as part of the process of insurrection. People call in the Waymos and they light them on fire. They bring the lime scooters and they tie them together and use them as blockades. And so that's part of the kind of technical landscape. As far as I can tell, this is the first time that's happened in the US. Right now, apps are such a part of everyday life that people are learning how to turn these kinds of things against their uses, and that's interesting, right? But I don't know that it changes any of the stuff that I'm talking about at this very general level. So I guess basically the idea is that I don't think of the commune or the council as either a form or a content, right? I'm trying to suggest that both of those approaches are limited, right? The formal approach is pretty easy to see why it's limited. And this is the original critique of council communism from the perspective of communization, which is that there was this kind of formalism that assumed that if you just put this form in place, that was communism, right? And so people like Bordiga and the communization theorists who were influenced by him, took this and they were like, that's meaningless. This form could be used to reproduce capitalism or the state or democracy. And they're totally right. And so they emphasize content, and they're like, content is important. Who's doing it matters. What they're doing matters, right? So for Bordiga, the only thing that matters is content. But that's also kind of a problem too, because it leads to this almost like idealism, right? Like for him, it's really like you just need the people who are like the smart people who know the theory, and you have to make sure that it's like, that the content is correctly Marxist, right? But there's various versions of this. But obviously I don't think that form is indifferent. Form may not be sufficient, but I don't think all forms are equally good for the construction of communism. So instead of approaching from the side of form or content, and I think I could have made this clearer in the book, what I'm offering is kind of an account of functions, right? So there's one way to look at the Workers' Council as having to fulfill certain functions, or the commune, right? Like, and I could list them. I've written something since the book came out that'll be out shortly, which tries to kind of like, outline these functions in the form of 10 theses. But there's, of course, the danger of that, of just being too schematic, right? But you can list the sort of functions that any revolutionary organization would need to fulfill in order to produce communism. You have to suspend the armed power of the state. You have to be inclusive in a way that makes it a revolution of the vast majority, right? And not of some particular group who might become a kind of new power over society, right? The only way that you can have a revolution that abolishes classes, right? This is like Marx's first like trick, is that it's a revolution that is a revolution of the majority, which can't then be a ruling class. It can't be a power over itself, except by becoming a non-majority, right? And so the very fact of that is a check against the sort of the problems of revolution. So it has to be massive. It has to be inclusive. It has to be a form that can bring people in. It has to be expansive, right? And there's lots of forms that aren't going to do that, right? It has to be kind of plastic and changeable. And it has to be something that can like spread throughout the entirety of the society, right? And like capillarial, like down to the, everyone is potentially organized through it. But at the same time, that's also not sufficient, because it has to do things. It has to be able to plan in common, like how people are going to live and make, actual kind of decisions about very practical kind of matters, right? It has to do so in a way that doesn't involve any power over other people, right? Because of the nature of it having to be a project for the vast majority, you can't just tell people what to do, right? And this is the problem with communism, is once you get rid of class society and you abolish the armed power of the state, you can't just run around pointing guns at people and telling them what to do. That's not going to work. You've empowered people and you've distributed power throughout the society. You have to figure out some way to have the organization of society be essentially something that people assent to, right? And because people have this fundamental power to revoke their participation. And that's what they do in all revolutions, right? And that's why it's important to kind of look at how things unfold in Spain China and Soviet Union, because it's very hard to get people to do things through coercion and violence alone if you're not going to use the time-tested and honored mechanisms of capitalism, right? So they're very good at that. But if you want to do it without that, you're going to have a real hard time. And that's what a lot of revolutionaries just really think, that we just need to like tell people what to do. And we can get by on discipline and consistency and ethics. And I think that's just nonsense. I'll not say those things aren't valuable, but I don't think that they're sufficient. So it also has to be a mechanism for planning. It has to be, it has to connect people. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but like, those are a few principles, right? And so and this is a question of the name, right? Whatever we call it doesn't matter to me, but I insist that any emergence of communism, and this is not true even of revolution, I would say any communism would have to fulfill these functions, right? It would have to abolish the armed power of the state. It would have to be inclusive. It would have to be extensive and allow for coordination and planning in common. There may be a non-revolutionary path towards that, right? That doesn't involve, revolution. Some process of kind of breakdown of society and cultural transformation, the emergence of kind of new ethics. This is kind of the more Commodian vision. I think it's possible, right? And this comes to questions of ethics and culture and subjectivity, about which there's much that I can say that's essential, right? What we're talking about is a process that will also be accompanied by a total transformation of subjectivity and culture and ethics, and a transvaluation of all values, right? There'll be this kind of total, but that's a process that is like going to be figured out by the people themselves. And for me, it's very hard to say anything in general about that process. I think one has to become a kind of a guru or a mystic or something, maybe become a Kama, as it were. So I'm open to that possibility, but I do think that still revolution is, a structure that is continuing. I mean, we continue to see the uprisings in our time. They're not grasping for this other thing. They're grasping for revolution. They keep pushing forward. They talk about it. They use the term. And I think that they're looking for these kinds of forms that could, that could function, that could fulfill these functions, forms and contents that could fulfill these functions. Oh yeah, the question of emergence and Luxemburg. I mean, that's really, yeah. I think Rosa Luxemburg is a very, very interesting thinker. There's another way to say why. So originally this book I was going to call The Test of Communism. One person who was on a panel with me, he's like, well, I think the book's more about communism than it is about revolution. And I think that that's fair. In the sense that, like I said, I could talk about communism in this kind of general way as principles or logic or functions, but I can't tell a particular story. Like, now you do this, then you do that, then you do this. And so in that sense, it's likely to be unsatisfying to people who are like, how do we make the revolution? I can't answer that question, right? I don't believe that any individual can write a book that answers that question. And so in that sense, I believe that emergence, which is fundamentally to me the language of self-organization, right? Social struggles are emergent. And you see this again and again, is that they don't conform to anyone's ideas about what they should be, and they tend to emerge when people are least predicting them, and they're not tractable to political recuperation. They can't be ordered from around. They can't be told what to do. There's this kind of vision that they're like, they need organization. Like if you had a party that could come in and like tell people what to do, it would work. But what's great about Luxemburg is she shows why that it didn't work then, didn't work 120 years ago. And it never works because there's something about the emergent character of mass struggle that is always going to exceed any kind of existing organization or institution. It's of course organized. I want to insist that it's not chaos or disorder, it's organization. What it isn't, though, and I think that this is a helpful distinction, is there's a difference between organization and planning. And planning is a higher level of organization in which you organize in advance, right? And so some organizations have this capacity for planning. They organize things in advance. That's what you don't see in the more spontaneous organizations to a great extent. I think yeah, and I think that there's a vision of revolution that doesn't want to accept that self-organization and emergence is the fundamental character. I also think it's a limit, though. I also think that the character of kind of emergence and self-organization is also something that needs to be overcome by the revolution itself, in as much as it starts to produce real issues. And just as a matter of a kind of inability of different people to know what's going on, right? The organization that's necessary is an organization that can allow the kind of movement to understand itself and see itself. And that's one of the things that the councils are supposed to do. But we can get back to this, the questions that Gerard was asking. Let me see. One thing that I would just say again is that because I'm focusing on functions, that allows it to see these things as a form of activity, right? And that's a way one way to like characterize the communization critique of council communism is that, and this is somewhat vulgar, but that council communists think of communism as a noun, and we think of it as a verb, right? And I do think it's better to think of communism as a verb, but I also think you can think of the Workers' Council as a verb, or the commune as a verb, right? That's what Marx is saying when he's saying it's a thoroughly expansive form. Like, it has a trajectory, it's in movement. And to me, that's all what communism is. It's a dynamic kind of process that involves constant change. It's not static. And the value of these things like the Workers' Council is that it's expansive. It could be something through which this kind of dynamic interplay is conducted. And I should say that there's probably so many ways that this could be done that wouldn't look like the classic Workers' Council or commune. There's a particular delegate structure that's like, this is how you do it, like things like every 1,000 people gets one delegate, or even the idea of having the delegates, be kind of nested in federal structures. All of this could be rethought. The only requirement is that there is some process of coordination, which requires delegation, because not everybody can be in the same room and debate something. And so, so I'm trying to kind of say, like, this is something that we should accept about the nature of the process of overcoming class society. And there may be many ways to deal with this. And there may be many names that we would give to it. Like, I'm not committed to calling it a Workers' Council or a commune. Some talks, people have said, why don't we call it, in the United States, it would be better to call it like a quilombo or a maroon. And I'm like, yeah, that would be great. What matters to me is that it's what it does. And I think, just like I said, like, because I'm talking in a very general way, these sort of questions about what do we call it, or how do we use AI, or all that stuff are good questions, but not questions that in this thing I feel like I can answer. And maybe that gets back to, I was going to say, just on the question of like these other revolutions, is that one thing I say in the beginning of the book is that they're like, or I actually say this in the second chapter, but that coming out of Marx, there's like two ways to understand the value of a book like Capital, or the usefulness of Capital. Is there's one sense in which he gives you this heuristic understanding of what capitalism is, so you can see its deep structures, and you can see how they need to be destroyed, and you can see why they're bad. And this is a way of kind of like sharpening the cognition that communists already have about the nature of capitalism, right? I feel like the first part of Marx's Capital does this. But there's a whole other aim that Marx has, which is to come up with like a account of the trajectory and the dynamics of capitalism, right? How it's changing, how it's emerging, the tendencies that are emerging, and like that's a whole like level of analysis that I just put to the side in this book, because of what I want to do, and that's a problem. You know, that's a limit. So there is another way to approach this from that sense of like, what are the tendencies? What's happening in society? Where do you think the trigger points are? That's typically where the way I've most often approached things. But in this book, I wanted to do something a little bit different. And probably the next book is going to be the tendency book, where I can maybe start to kind of say more about, you know, how the transformation of kind of labor, for example, has changed things. You know, so for one thing, I do want to, I mean, one of the problems of the book is that because I'm trying to insist on what remains the same, I give short shrift to what's different, right? And so this whole thing about how, you know, the circle and the ellipse, you know, the end of the workers' movement, it's like a big part of my argument in the book. Like for why, for example, if we were to have workers' councils, they wouldn't be centered on the workplace today. It wouldn't make sense to do that in the way that it made sense in 1918. You know, that I've given a lot of attention to that claim elsewhere in my theory, but here it sort of gets, it's so small that you might miss it, which is sort of a problem with the book. But it's also because it just opens up this vast topic. And some people, I think, were disappointed that there wasn't more about that. And I can understand that. But I feel like if I did talk about that, I wouldn't have been able to do this other thing where I'm like, this is the way in which the project of still revolution is still the same or has been invariant in some ways. And this is what's changed. But yeah. So I don't know. Hopefully I answered a lot of your questions. Maybe we can get into some of the stuff Gerardo was bringing up at the end, because I think it's like the spicy, important stuff.
I know we're 10 minutes left if we want to do an hour and a half. Do you want to say something about your own experience playing with language? The reference I made to your book. Yeah,
That's great.
poetry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Obviously, I really like sentences and I like to write. And I admire good writing. And I think that there's something more to language than denotation, right? One of the reasons why I love Marx is that he's a really fucking good writer. And there's stuff that comes through in his writing that isn't denotative. It's at the level of figure and style. And I would like to believe that there are things about communism that you can communicate through metaphor and through style, that, you know, that come through in the book. Obviously, I really do want to be clear and try to kind of lay things out. And I'm always trying to be clear too, but at the same time, I do, you know, I do like beautiful language. And I do think that language is, I think that the aesthetic power of language, well, for me, in some way, you know, I think Marx's vision of what communism is a fundamentally aesthetic vision. It's like indebted to romanticism in the sense of like the point of life in communism is to be self-cultivation, right? And aesthetic cultivation is like one form of that, but there's spiritual, ethical, and I think he's right. I think that is what, if we were, you know, if we organize society in a kind of in a way that was conducive with human nature, you know, a lot of what we would do would be playing music, and everybody has that capacity, and to me that's what is like, there's the idea that like our society is full of all of these Michelangelos who never get a chance to make art, right? Everybody loves art, at whether they like to, you know, or most everyone, right? And the people who don't, they have some other thing that they're into, right? That's the same thing. And so to me, that's the point of life, and I think Marx thought it was the same. So so I guess there's something in the sense of like that I communicate the pleasure that the pleasure I take in language and the pleasure I take in writing about communism, I hope can communicate some sense that the aesthetic is this, as Adorno says, promesse de bonheur. It's this, it's this promise of that every great work of art like is a placeholder for a kind of experience that communism can realize. And that's, I'm a by what I do for work is I teach classes on literature, and this is kind of what I try to tell them, right? And I think where I want to go is with this and getting into the idea of the tendency is that for Marx, like the idea of the good for Marx is as he says, free development, right? Free many-sided development. It's the idea that we want variety, we want kind of dynamic change, and we want to be many-sided, right? Not one, like the bad is one-sided, like an assembly line. You're just like hitting the same thing with your tool. And like, and that's something that affects our nerves, our muscles, and our brains, right? It says like our society is so one-sided that we're like, it just deforms our bodies and our brains. I think this is totally true in the age of AI, right? It's just deep one-sidedness, and that the value is many-sidedness, that we will develop and cultivate ourselves, and that will involve some activities that might be productive, some that aren't, or even maybe the distinction between that would be overcome. And so I think that's a really great way to I think he says, where the free development is like the criterion of life. Like, does this, and that's a great decision. Like, what does this, should we do this or should we not? Like, does it impede anybody's free development? What is the most conducive for the free development of people? I mean, I'm not saying that there's like some like number we can come up with, but it's a way of conceiving of trying to come up with an equilibrium, or dynamic equilibrium, not a static one, where my development and your development are not at odds, but co-constitutive. And I think that we can even extend that to the relationship between, of the human metabolism with nature, right? I mean, in some way, like humans, I think, value ecology for its own sake. Like, many of us value having a living ocean, or like, ecosphere that hasn't been destroyed. And that's because we recognize free development. That's to say, most of us, if somebody was like, should I like kill this beautiful animal for no reason? You'd be like, no, don't do that, right? Because it's like something that's freely developing. We like to let things, develop. And a lawn doesn't really develop, but like a forest kind of does. So I don't know. This is where I'm starting to kind of think through some stuff, and this would be kind of the next book. Maybe going towards my Kamadian mysticism, my old age.
No, that's very interesting, because while you were saying that, I was thinking, in Chile, for instance, there is a very interesting philosopher, Carlos Casanova, who wrote a dissertation, later on published as a book, about the sensible dimension in Marx's thought, in relation to that sort of unexplored form of freedom of the human species, that I would say, and this is I think important. I think it relates also to the commentary that Catherine made, which has to do with taking a distance from thinking freedom as a Republican thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Because now, well, not now, but in Spain, there have been books about this. Marx as a great Republican thinker, right? But Republicanism is just a management, and this is why I think, Jasper, not that I want to insist on it, but it doesn't. It's not a question of not taking the question of metaphysics directly. It's sometimes that metaphysics takes us into its path, right? Mm-hmm. And so political freedom, if Marx is just a thinker of political freedom, then that means that we're still in Aristotelian metaphysics. Mm. That means that we're just thinking of non-domination, and where life, I would translate your words as the capacity of human imagination and the freedom of life of life's temporality is subsumed or subordinated to political administration, you know, to the logistics of the police. And so, I mean, what you're saying now about the question of freedom in Mars, I think is crucial, right?
Yeah.
But I think
I
it
think
pushes us to take a distance from the politic thing.
I agree. And that's why, I mean, there is a Republican interpretation of the Workers' Council. And even you can see it, you know, they talk about it a council republic, and that was going to be a limit. That would reinscribe the nation state. And so that's why I want to, there, like even within council communism, there was this tendency towards constitutionalism that was a danger. Yeah. So I think we absolutely agree on that. Yeah.